Hello everyone, welcome back to Janus Academy. This is our series Historical Analogies, and we are at our 18th entry, I think. This is going to be the analogy, the relation between Fauvism on one end and color field painting on the other. So when we're talking about color field painting, we are talking about a very peculiar stylistical formation that happened after World War II. And that really marked, I would say, years 50 and 60, fifth and sixth decade of the 20th century. Connections with Fauvism are many, and a lot of them are very apparent. A lot of them are really quite obvious, up to the point that it was a somewhat, not to say embarrassing, experience thinking about this video, if we should make it at all. I thought it was going to be too obvious, but then I decided to go ahead and do it anyhow because it really fits with our general plan here, and it really fits with the general unfolding of stylistical formations, not only in the 20th century, but before that as well. We started with Romanesque, and we are going to finish with the end of the 20th century. So I think I want to start by saying that these two eras are very similar in one very peculiar aspect that is going to show itself to be very important, that it's going to really define both of these eras in a very important manner. And this is the peculiar situation where these stylistical formations that we're talking about are surrounded by many other stylistical formations that are happening at the same time. So this is not always the case. And it's not always so that we have more stylistical formations happening at the same time, and that we have them influencing one another, sometimes positively, sometimes negatively. So we can say that there are certain similarities that are shared between let's say biomorphism and primitivism and analytical cubism or synthetic cubism, and we can then find many similarities between cubism and surrealism. They're happening roughly at the same time. But we don't have this situation when it comes to, let's say, Renaissance period, when we're talking about Italy. You could argue that Renaissance in France has resistance when it comes to Gothic style, because it's a style that came from Italy, and the Gothic style came from France. So when French people started importing Renaissance to Italy, or where Renaissance simply imposed itself as the dominant style, there was some contact, there was some clashing, there was some mutually shared influences. And this is not the case in Italy, where we can say that Renaissance was a dominant style. You could argue the same thing about Baroque, that it was a dominant style. Even more so, I would argue Baroque, because unlike the Renaissance, this was a style that was specifically designed by the church, and it had a very specific agenda. So it was sort of imposed, and it didn't necessarily stand for any competition in this particular regard. It's a completely different situation when we're talking about Fauvism on one end and color field on the other, especially so if we think about the fact that color field painting is often associated with abstract expressionism, that a lot of people, or a lot of art historians, see it as but a branch of abstract expressionism. Now, we choose to see it as its own thing. I mean, of course, it's connected to abstract expressionism in many ways. In many ways, it's different from abstract expressionism. The point I'm trying to make here is that while color field is happening, it is surrounded by many other stylistical formations, like action painting that we've previously discussed, like generally, broadly speaking, abstract expressionism, like optical art. Some of the other stylistical formations that we are not going to address here, like, let's say, lyrical abstract painting, that we could also do, but we choose not to, and I'll explain why later. So we have these different stylistical formations that take place at the same time. And it's a very interesting thing, because this happens at the beginning of the 20th century, rather turn of the century, late 19th, early 20th, and then it happens after World War II. And it's painting a broader picture, because we'll be talking about, let's say, expressionism and neo-expressionism in one of our later sequent entries. So this is showing this general broader tendency that the second half of the 20th century, to a large extent, is repeating the first half of the 20th century. This is a very interesting situation, because we're talking about postmodernism on one end and modernism on the other. not about modernity, which is a much broader term, but really, stylistically speaking, modernism. We have this whole idea that postmodernism is recapitulating and rehashing all of the ideas that were present in modernism, but it's doing so, of course, in a different manner. It's doing so with a certain historical and, I would argue, intellectual and spiritual distance. A certain amount of irony as well, obviously. And we have this particular situation really come into an important play when it comes to action painting, conceptual art, optical art, etc. Now, this is really important because these different stylistical formations that contact and that get in touch and that influence one another often come from incredibly different places. They come from fundamentally different ways of looking at art. They come from the fact that some of them are formalist and some of them are informal, meaning that some of them are representative and some of them are abstract. And there cannot be a greater difference in the world of art between these two. If you are dealing with something that is recognizable, if you're painting a thing or drawing or photographing, it doesn't really matter, that is recognizable, that exists, that you can, perceive in this particular manner, or you are dealing with an abstract form that is invented, fictional, and does not exist in the real world. So these are two very, very different takes on things. You can also say that it really matters how you look at art. We talked about conceptual art in one of our previous entries, and we spoke about this tendency that conceptual art has is to really deconstruct the very notion of art, to situate it entirely within the realm of ideas, which is why it dealt with text so much, which is why it dealt with this idea that you want to decompose the very essence of art. So there were artistic pieces where people would give you a description of what kind of pigments are in the color, for example. So they wouldn't paint a painting with color, they would give you a textual description of what happens with pigments and what happens with paint, etc. So we are talking about very different takes on things, and these profoundly different views of what art is define these specific stylistical formations. Now, I want to take this back to the entrance to the Orsay Museum. This is the example we've already taken because it's a great example and it's incredibly useful for what we're doing here. At the entrance to the Orsay collection on the ground floor, if you go to the right, you get yourself into a gallery that's dedicated to academic painting, a branch of neoclassicism that they call academism here in France. And so you can see that on one wall there's Ingres, on the other there's Delacroix. Delacroix is a romanticist. He does not belong to academism. They've placed his painting there so as to contrast what academism was all about. And so you see that Ingres, a phenomenal painter, is all about drawing, and it's all about structure, and it's all about design, whereas Delacroix is all about movement and passion and color. And the painting they presented there specifically has basically no drawing. This is a very interesting thing. It's just masses of color. So it's basically a painting that is made without structure. And then this is really relevant for Impressionism later, because much of Impressionism does the same thing. We are seeing paintings without drawing. And this is a profoundly different take on drawing. And this is also showing us the tendency that we have, I would argue, from the very beginnings of art, if you will, but also from beginnings of Romanesque art, which is chronologically, I think, the oldest era that we were discussing in this series of analogies, is that we can focus on one or the other aspect of art. We can either focus on truth or on beauty. We can focus on substance or absence of substance. We can focus on drawing and on painting, or rather the paint. Now, I don't personally believe in dichotomies. I've dealt with them a lot throughout my studies. I know that many different theories suggest dichotomies. I think the world is much more complex than black and white, good or bad. So I don't personally partake, but I do see this tendency unraveling itself in domains of art, and I see a lot of artists partaking in this. You are either in this tribe or you are in that tribe. You're either a friend or an enemy. Again, I believe things are more in the shades of gray rather than in black and white. So I would like to just underline that this usage of dichotomies is very conditional. It does not deal with the absolutes, at least as far as I'm concerned. So we are not going to be talking about this as this be-all, end-all difference, but it is really important. It is really important if you situate your efforts into drawing or if you situate them into color, usage of color and paint. It's also important because we have this very important tendency present from beginning of Impressionism to basically today, contemporary art, that we want to focus more and more. We want to limit our field of action. This is really important, and it really, I think, has a lot to do with technology. It has a lot to do with how technology develops in the Industrial Revolution. We limit our field of action more and more. We spoke about this previously when it came to science and development of science. When it came to specialization, the fact that, let's say, back in the day, you had physicians, people who were medical practitioners, who dealt with human health in general. And then as medicine developed, we started having people who specialize. So people specialize in bones, or they specialize in certain organs, or they specialize in like your internal chemistry in many different ways. Even within a certain organ, you can say that if you're a neurologist or a neurosurgeon, you can specialize within that very vast domain. So we have this general tendency of quasi-infinite specialization, which means that we are limiting our fields of actions furthermore. And this is really important when it comes to color field painting, because I mean the title itself is about color field. It speaks of a certain field which is limited. And we'll get in a moment to talk about how important technology and technique both are in all of this. So I want to go back to this the difference between a drawing and paint, usage of paint and indeed painting, because drawing is really all about borders. It's all about how you separate things one from another, how you delineate, how a line creates a very definitive statement on an empty canvas. And that indeed it is all about the structure. Drawing is the structure of the painting. There can be no discussion about this. So you could say that within these this dichotomal way of viewing, of looking at things, you would associate a line with reason, with this cognitive capacity we have to recognize things and to classify and to categorize, and indeed to separate them. You need to separate if you want to categorize and classify. So this will be connected to the drawing. And then on the other end, we have color, which is all about emotion, and it's all about subjectivity, and it's all about how you feel, and it's a state of your being rather than anything else. It is not something that can be classified in the same manner. You cannot put an Excel table sorry, about structure of feelings. I mean, I guess you could, but you wouldn't do a very good job out of it. You wouldn't really be very precise in dealing with feelings if you're to do it in a strictly rational, reasonable manner. So you could say that there was this division between people who were interested in the structure of things, and they were invested in drawing, and then there was on the other end people who were more into softer or more opaque or more I wouldn't necessarily say oniric, but harder to comprehend, or different way to comprehend the domain, which is emotions. And this really takes us back to Fauvism on one end and then color field on the other, because both of these styles are all about human feelings. They have this premise that feelings are where it's at. All the more given the industrial background of both of these eras, because both of them exist in the world that is dominantly ran and shaped and influenced by the industrial process. And both of these stylistical formations deal with the human experience. I would argue that it's the most important aspect of both Fauvism and color field painting, and we're going to get to that a bit later. we're going to give some examples to substantiate this claim. We are talking, when we were talking about Fauvism, this idea that you want to simplify things in terms of color, but you want colors to be very popping, you want them to be very bright, and you want them to reveal the inner truth about what is being depicted. Now, I would like to make a distinction between Fauvism and pointillism and divisionism, because they too use bright colors. We spoke about these previously, but they go about it in a very scientific manner. They go about it in the manner that even though they're not invested in drawing in line quite as much or at all, they have a scientific method almost to them, and they really think about deconstructing color, about, well, divisionism truly draws its name from it, that the action to divide so as to better understand, so as to better use. And their main goal is to infuse as much light in painting as possible, which of course takes us back to medieval context and all of that. It's not the same with Fauvism. Their idea is not that they want to scientifically examine the human being and its different states. Quite opposite to that. They are seeking the non-scientific route. They're seeking to have empathy with the human being. They're seeking to understand a human being not with your mind but with your heart. It's this whole idea that humanity stays with your emotions, and it proposes a completely different aesthetics. It proposes a completely different way of understanding what art is. What is art all about? Now, you've noticed that when we're talking about 20th century art, a lot of it is very strongly connected to aesthetics. A lot of it is very strongly connected to philosophy. We've mentioned the different philosophers as being incredibly important in shaping a lot of these stylistical formations. We've spoken about some anthropologists that were incredibly important. So on one end, you could argue that Freud and Jung were very important. On the other, Hegel was very important and still is. Kant is very important and still is. Heidegger, Wittgenstein. So these are all people whose, well, Nietzsche, of course, if you want to see him as a philosopher, not to get into that whole discussion. But yeah, these were all very important impulses, not just as ways in which we can understand these stylistical formations, but really they were important influences onto artists themselves. Artists themselves read these philosophers and they were informed by them, and they created their own expressions formed by their philosophical works. And you could say that art truly is becoming more and more philosophical, even in this particular case when art is explicitly against being philosophical, when art claims that it's all about your human state of existence, when art seeks to go to the essence of who you are, and when it seeks to see humanity through this particular lens, that it sees humanity as being best observed through emotions. Now, this, of course, when it comes to Fauvism, has a lot to do with the spleen, and it has a lot to do with the colonial image of the world. It has a lot to do with people in Europe feeling incredibly bored and divorced from their substance. So they want to go to exotic places, and they want to, well, indulge in what today we call sexual tourism, and which is a very dark affair altogether. So this is Fauvism, whereas color field painting doesn't quite have that colonial framework. It has a completely different framework that comes from a completely different ideological position. But the fact remains that they both situate their worldview with human feelings, with emotions, and this is what they're interested in. This is what they're interested in. They want to see painting through this particular lens. Now, I want to go back to this anecdote that I previously communicated, again, possibly more than once, that has to do with a course of aesthetics that I took at my university during my basic studies. The courses that lasted for 3 years. This was the largest exam that we had to give in terms of how long the lectures lasted. And this question that was asked of us at the very beginning, what do we think art is? How do we explain art to aliens that would land on planet Earth and they never saw art before, they never saw anything made by humans before, so how would we explain it to them? And my answer to that was, well, art is something that provokes feelings, and of course my professor did not agree with that, because of course. amongst other reasons, because this is just one of the ways in which you can understand art, but for many other reasons as well. Uh, what I want to stress when I bring forward this anecdote is that these particular artists felt this way. So they disagree with my professor of aesthetics, and they felt that that's what they were invested in. That's what they wanted to do. Both people acting as Fauvists and people acting within the realm of color field painting. They wanted to convey emotions and they wanted to explore emotions. They felt that everything else is, well, basically a waste of time. Now, you will see this attitude persisting in a lot of the 20th century. And it really has to do with what we already mentioned, specialization, this whole idea that you want to go and focus on one particular aspect of art. So it's really, really different to observe both a Fauvist painting or a color field painting than to observe, let's say, a Baroque or a Renaissance painting, because there you have a total work of art, meaning that you have all of the aspects of the work of art brought together. And all of the 20th century, through its different stylistical formations, is basically this effort for us to separate and categorize and further develop our interests. We could say that optical art, we were talking about it, has a completely different ambition than color field painting. And we cannot properly interpret or understand these works of art if we are to assume the same position, if we are to assume the same aesthetical apparatus. It just doesn't work because they have completely different goals. It's an even better comparison to be made between conceptual art and color field painting, or pretty much any other really visual form of art, because it has a completely different goal. It completely goes outside of the field of what we previously understood as art. So you can look at the work of conceptual art, and if you are to try to analyze it using the same tools that you would use to analyze, let's say, a Fauvist work of art, you would really get nowhere. You would say this is nonsense. It's completely pointless. It's a waste of space. It's a waste of time. That of the artist, that of the gallerist, and that of the spectator. But the whole thing is that we need to look at the 20th century art as a totality and as a way for all of these different stylistical formations to deal with a certain aspect of a much greater global affair that is art. And I really like to compare this to medicine. I don't know why, but I do. Is that you have a specialist for the brain, you have a specialist for the heart, you have the specialist, I guess, for the liver, for any other organ or set of organs. So if you look at the totality of a human body, you can say, okay, a generalist physician would deal with the totality of a human body, but then you have these guys or girls that specialize in certain areas. And then those specializations get even more focused, and then they get even more focused, etc. So when we're talking about Fauvism and colored field painting, we are talking about this tendency to specialize. Especially, this is very poorly worded, but what are you going to do? When it comes to analogy between these two stylistical formations, because Fauvism still is very much a representative art. If you're looking at Fauvist paintings, in many cases you can still recognize what's going on. You can see when Gauguin's paintings that it's mostly either European peasants or sceneries or petit bourgeois doing whatever they do, or it's the people in Tahiti doing whatever they do. It's an interesting thing to mention that a lot of the people in Tahiti were wearing clothes, and then Gauguin came and wanted to paint them naked, and it's like, yeah, take your clothes off, and they're like, but why? And it's like, no, just do it, it's because he had his own colonial orientalizing idea of what a primitive person is supposed to look and act like, but whatever. So you can say that you recognize things. It's representational painting, whereas that's not necessarily the case with color field painting. There you can see, shapes, broadly speaking. Most famous color field painters really only deal with shapes that are very, very simple. I mean, Rothko is obviously the most important and the most famous artist of them all. We're going to be spending most of our time talking about Rothko. And what he is very well known for are just squares or rectangles rather that stand in certain relations to one another. So most of his paintings are really just that. The whole point with it really is the color. So it's the color and what it does, and it's the color, how we perceive it, and what kind of impression it has on us. Now I would just like to mention this historical curiosity that Matisse, as one of the main proponents of Fauvism, got to live long enough to see color-filled painting emerge. He died in 50s, if I'm not mistaken. In the 50s, we already had color-filled emerging, so he was arguably a bridge between these two styles, if nothing else, then chronologically. And if you look at Matisse's work as a Fauvist, the Fauvist rather, you can see how gradually it becomes simpler and simpler. How he starts off, well, with fairly simplified take on things, with color blocks rather than anything else. And you can see how even then it gradually goes to greater and greater simplicity. So if you were to look at Matisse's life and chronology of his works, you can see how it almost reaches color-filled painting, how his own paintings start looking strangely like, not quite, but a step away from what we are discussing here. And it's a similar thing, let's say, with Cézanne and Cubism, that Cézanne really almost made Cubism. So when you look at the chronology of his works, you can see how he got to geometrize his works more and more and more until he got to create something that looks very, very similar to what Picasso and Braque and the others would do later. So Matisse had this going on for him, and he was probably able to see some of color-filled painting works of art in his lifetime. Now, they both, of course, had this tendency and this driving motivation of seeking humanity, because both of these styles existed in industrial capitalism. Now, capitalism was very different, industrial capitalism at the turn of the century and then after World War II. And you could connect this difference partially to what was happening in our society, and you can partially connect it to how artists were reacting to that. We said that colonialism was arguably at its peak at the turn of the century, late 19th, early 20th, what we also know as La Belle Époque, the beautiful era that was very beautiful for a very limited number of people and downright atrocious for pretty much the rest of the world. We can say that what starts happening after World War II is the process of decolonializations. We have this whole idea of colonies wanting their independence, of liberating themselves. This is, of course, followed by a lot of warfare. So India becomes independent, Algeria becomes independent, Vietnam becomes independent, Cuba, many other formerly colonial countries fight for their independence. And this is something that truly marks the second half of the 20th century. China also, incredibly importantly, becomes independent, fights against its colonial status. Though it was never quite as bad for China as it was for India, but not to get into that whole thing. It's a whole other topic. I don't want to offend 1.4 billion Chinese people by comparing them to, 1.4 billion of Hindu people, of Indian people. But anyhow, so yeah, I would actually offend almost 3 billion people in one fell swoop. I mean, that would be an accomplishment. The whole thing is that we go through this whole period of decolonialization that has its influence on the first world, where most of these artistical and stylistical formations are coming from. So they see it, well, as a different thing. Their societies are shaped by all of this. You can think about, let's say, the British Empire, the Great Britain, that before World War II was the largest colonial empire, the largest empire really that world had ever seen. I think it controlled something like 1/4 of the planet, which is crazy to think about it. And if you think about them controlling naval routes, and if you think about them controlling the waves, as they like to point it out, they ruled the oceans, then that space would be even greater. And if you were to think about the importance of trade networks, that would be then even more relevant to what we're talking about. But then, after World War II, they start gradually losing their colonial empire. It starts shrinking, and they're no longer the dominant hegemon. They're no longer colonial power, as it were. certainly not comparable to what they were before World War II. So things change, and you can understand that this influences a lot of people in the First World and the British Empire themselves. So it has its reflection onto art too. And you can say that this search for substance has a lot to do with that as well, because both Fauvists within their colonial world are looking for substance, and then people in post-colonial world or the world that is liberating itself from colonialism, they too look for substance. And it's the same thing they're doing, but again, in different historical circumstances. We want to say that this whole thing has to do with chronological process and how it develops. We see the drawing, if we go back to Ingres on one end and Delacroix on the other, we see how drawing gradually turns to letters. It gradually grows into either very strict lines that we see in minimalism or in optical art, or it really becomes just a notion, it becomes just a concept. And then we see the development of color, because color stays with this idea that it's about human emotions, it's about the human state. It really is about humanity. And I think we need to further explain how is this connected to technology, because we already said that it had to do with capitalism, with colonialism, but it really has to do with technology in itself. And what I refer to when I say this is that it has to do with the invention and usage of acrylic colors. Acrylic is a very important invention because it's basically liquid plastic. Acrylic color is different than oil-based color that had to do with natural pigments. And this is something we really need to explain because it has to do with the title, color field painting. Now, when you paint, as I have, quite unsuccessfully, which I persist in doing, again, quite unsuccessfully. So when you paint using oil paints, you notice that they're not terribly precise, meaning that if you put a dot of paint, you need to dilute that paint in oil and turpentine, and that there's always a margin around the color. There's always a margin of oil, like a splash of oil or a dab or a puddle that goes around the, well, color field, if you will. So this is what happens with usage of oil, and this is something that gives a certain quality to art. It gives a certain quality to your work of art, because this smudginess actually helps with shades, it helps with gradients, it helps with translucency, and it certainly gives a certain depth to whatever you're painting. So you could say that if you compare a tempera painting on one end with oil painting on the other, you can see just how different they are, because tempera is diluted in water, and oil paint, of course, is diluted in oil. And you can see that tempera paintings don't really have this depth, this complexity that you get out of oil. But also tempera, much like acrylic, has more precision. And this is the thing. This is really good when you're looking at, let's say, Renaissance paintings, that earlier Renaissance paintings are still made with tempera that was mostly used in medieval paintings, whereas some later ones are more and more oil-based paint. And you can see the difference. You can see that certain type of complexity, presence, thickness, mass, certain treatment of light is simply not possible if you're not using oil paint. Now, this is not what they want to do. When it comes to color field theory, they want to basically have a clean cut corners, and they want to have a clean cut line of what is the color field, the field in which we have the color. So this is the invention of acrylic paint, or rather broad spread usage of acrylic paint, that changes how we see art as well. It gives different capacities to artists to begin with. And this is something that has been happening with World of Art basically since, well, the very beginnings. In our other series that's dedicated to history of art, we're going to be talking about how technology developed and how, well, human consciousness developed and how tools that we use developed. I will probably have a completely separate series dedicated to technology and development of technology and how it shaped the civilization we live in. The point is that the development of technology profoundly shaped, the world of art and expressive capacities that artists had. So usage of acrylic paint was fundamental in the possibility of color field art existing, because as the name suggests, it's all about a certain, field of color, space, let's say, filled with color, and how it interacts with the rest of the world. Now, this is really important because I argue that, not that I argue, it's a given fact, that this is a plastic paint. So it's basically liquid plastic, acrylic. And it tells us so much about, I mean, it's a beautiful symbol in itself, really. It tells us so much about this tendency that both Fauvist artists and color field artists have, which is to look for substance. Originality, humanity, really what is human, what is organic, what is raw, what is untainted by civilization. So you seek to go to the very depth of the human soul through inspecting its emotions, through inspecting how emotions work, and through representing emotions through color, via color. And that color is made of plastic. I mean, can you think of a more beautiful metaphor for the 20th century? Plastic that is symbolical for everything artificial, for everything that is detrimental to ecology, to our planet, everything that is destructive. It's a symbol of consumerism, of facility of consumption, of something that is briefly used and then discarded, and then something that we just used for perhaps, I don't know, 20 minutes or a couple of years, takes 400 years to dissolve and is burdening the environment. So yeah, there's many different ways in which we think about plastics, but we don't necessarily connect plastics with the essence of humanity. Oftentimes, we rather say that it's completely against it. We talk about presence of microplastics in our bodies and how it's a fairly detrimental thing that is hurting our health, that is hurting our endocrinological image. I mean, many other things. But I find it such a beautifully ironical situation here that this entire artistic stylistical formation is all about inspecting humanity. It's all about the religious and spiritual experience of art and of humanity, and it's made possible with plastic color, with liquid plastic. Yeah, I could drone on about this, obviously, for a very long time. I guess you appreciate the irony. The thing is really that this the most artificial of all things, arguably, allows us to create color that can do something that previous colors could not, that basically has different properties. It has different material, technical properties. And it's really interesting to think about the main goal of people like Rothko and many of his colleagues, and that is really to investigate the human experience, go in its essence, go to its profundity, and explore the joy and tragedy of existence. So this is really what color is supposed to do in color field painting, as much as it was supposed to do in Fauvism. It's to really be the carrier and the vehicle of humanity as such. And if you remember our previous lecture that was on conceptual art, where we talked about symbols and we talked about langue and parole, and how we have the physical form of something and then we have the essence, the structure of something, color here, as it was used by color field painters, was really to express humanity. It was to express what humans were all about. That's what color does. That's how they used it. And if we want to properly understand what they were about, we need to understand how they used it and how they saw it themselves. So it's like this really fundamental aspect of acrylic paint, that when you draw a field, a color field, you fill it with color, it does not go over its edge. It stays inside. And it's an interesting comparison to be made with the very beginning, the very initial premise of our lecture, that we made this distinction between drawing and paint, and how what really defines color field painting is this idea that color is limited, that it kind of deals with the essence of a drawing rather than with essence of paint, with essence of color. So you could say that color field painting does care about precision, and you would argue that precision comes more from the realm of the drawing, from the realm of that whole inquiry into what art is and what art is supposed to be all about. Here, we want to inspect emotions, humanity, organic, visceral aspects of existence, but we need precision, ultimate precision that is only made possible through plastic, well, liquid plastic color. So what becomes profoundly important in this particular case is color psychology. Now, we already mentioned Freud and Jung. These are but two names, two anthropologists and psychologists, really, they were both, that were fundamentally important and influential to all of the 20th century. We see that these artists are very much moved by the realm of psychology in general, by the realm of psychoanalysis. So they want their paintings to have this role. They want their paintings to inspect the human soul. But they suppose, and you might argue rightfully so, that art gives you this capacity to inspect the human soul better than even a therapist that's a trained professional that went to university and then specialization and whatever is able to. Because a therapist deals, again, with concepts. They deal with something that you can learn and cognate and understand, whereas art is an immediate, visceral or organic experience. And this would basically go back to the difference between a portrait and the photography. Now, you could argue that just a casually taken photography, not an artistic photography that has the actual creative persona as behind it, photography can capture your likeness, but it's not going to reveal much about who you are, about your character. For that to happen, you really have to have another person, you have to have another soul behind either a camera or an easel. It doesn't really matter, but you have to have another human being dealing with your representation, because it takes another human being to inspect another human being. A machine cannot inspect another human being. For a while, at least. We'll see if we eventually get there. Not to talk about the Turing test and all of it. The thing is that color field painting is all about color psychology. And color psychology is not just this idea that you can inspect other humans, or that humans can inspect themselves confronted to your work of art, but also that they want to throw away everything that is redundant. They want to focus, they want to simplify, and through that simplification, they want to reach the truth. The truth that for them is not in the realm of the concept, it's not in the realm of the message, it's in the realm of the experience, of the lived, organic, for-all emotional experience. Now, you could say that this type of art, therefore, insists on a certain type of human drama, of a certain type of human exaltation. And we'll get to talk about that when it comes to Rothko in a minute, what kind of experience he expected from his spectators and what kind of experience he did, well, receive in most cases. We need to go a step back and remind ourselves that the first historical analogy that we've done when it came to Fauvism was the connection between Baroque and Fauvism. And one of the main connections, one of the main links between these two eras was that Baroque was all about, well, the human drama. I would add not just human, but divine. It was this whole idea of art taking you to God, of art displaying the glory of God, and art being all about relation between humanity and divinity. It was, I subjectively think, the most ambitious artistical formation to our day, because it really sought to convey glory of God like no other artistic formation before. I think Gothic art got closest to it, arguably, but not to get into that now. The thing is that Baroque was all about, well, drama on a divine, universal scale. It was cosmic drama, really. And it's not an exaggeration to say that. Fauvism had it differently shaped. It was still about drama, but it was more about spleen and boredom and this want for experience. And it was, again, for want of exoticism, and it was very orientalistic. Color field drama is even more defined, it's even more precise, and it really sticks with the human. It really sticks with inspection of yourself. It's not as communal as both Baroque and Fauvism are. It does not necessarily seek to speak to the entirety of humanity in this particular way. It's more personal. And I will get to this when I start talking about Rothko's political activism, the fact that he was a communist and he was a very socially engaged individual in his time. So it's this idea that for Rothko, his paintings had a strong religious potency, and this is something that he said himself. Now, this is not us interpreting and saying, oh, this is all about God. He said it himself. It's a very interesting thing. He said that his paintings are capable of bringing people down to tears, and this is how people react. They see his paintings and they have this emotional breakdown. Basically, they start crying. And he was down with this. He said, yes, this is exactly how they should react to my paintings, because this is how I make them. I make my paintings in a sort of a religious trance. They are a religious experience for me. And then people who come to spectate and to enjoy them, they have that particular experience as well. And they break down in tears, and they had the same type of enthusiasm that I had as I was creating them. And I'm using the term enthusiasm quite deliberately, because it means the presence of God. When you have God inside you, you are enthusiastic. Now, this is really a self-inspection type of religious experience. Now, why is this so interesting? Well, it's interesting because Rothko was not what you would necessarily call a religious person. He had a fairly religious upbringing from an Orthodox Jewish family, and he basically disavowed religion after one event in his life. He vowed never to step foot in a synagogue again, so he deliberately cut all of ties with religion when his father died, and he remained this way up until, well, his last days. But then he said that his art was a religious experience. So how do you bring the two together? I would argue that the way you solve this paradox, or apparent paradox, is that Rothko had a thing against organized religions, and he had a thing against structure and system and, well, not to say administration, but you get the point, that is present in any organized religion in the world, or any organized system of faith, really. So he was not happy with that. He thought that religion was a personal experience, and he was arguably a bit Protestant in all of this, although he was technically, ethnically, and religiously speaking Jewish. But the idea to him was that it's a religious experience, that it's deeply personal, and it has, again, to do with world of art. It has to do with art being sacral and art being sacred, art dealing with the sacred. When he was creating his paintings, this is what he sought. He sought the sacred experience of organic, undiluted, authentic humanity. And as he said, he sought the experience that would speak to humans on a human level. Now, if you look at the genesis of his work, you see that he started dealing with mythological images, because from early on he was interested in drama that's present in the myth, the fact that myth in its way speaks the truth about humanity on a much deeper level, and that he really started doing this. He then got interested in surrealism, he then got interested in abstractions, and then he got into his own by making, well, paintings that he's most famous for, the rectangular and square shapes. If you look at the genesis of his creation, you can also see that he starts with fairly light colors that are very warm and somehow very positive, and then they grow darker and darker and darker, which culminates, sadly, arguably tragically, with his suicide. This is how Mark Rothko dies, is by suicide. So if you look at his creation, sadly, again, kind of makes sense that it would end in this way, because his paintings grow more and more, sombra. And if you think about the world he lived in, this kind of makes sense too, because he was not terribly happy about the world he lived in. Especially, he was not terribly happy about the artistic world. And although he had great success during his life, and then posthumously as well, obviously, he was very unhappy with this whole situation where his art is being purchased by wealthy people, that is being purchased by corporations and banks and other financial institutions, and that this whole religious experience that he wanted to share with the world was then placed in an office or in a hallway or a corporation. So he wasn't happy about that at all, because he thought that corporations and banks and other such places are the opposite of humanity. They are the opposite of whatever is good in the world. Now, again, Mark Rothko was a communist, and he was very socially and politically engaged. He was, basically involved in trying to bring forth his own worldview, not to argue how difficult it might have been or must have been to be a communist in McCarthy's America. I mean, yeah, that's a whole other story. But you can say that he really created his art for the people. And I really want to address this peculiar aspect of communism that I think is oftentimes overlooked in the West, or is just framed in a completely wrong manner. In the West, we have this idea that communism is all about crushing the human spirit, and it's all about monotony and everybody thinking the same way, and it's everybody sharing the vision of the great leader. Now, of course, as you can imagine, this has more to do with Western anti-communist propaganda than with communism itself. Now, people who are communists themselves, they would tell you that it's exactly the opposite, that it's true connection with your community and true liberation from, possession and of private possession. Rather, you get to truly become human. That communism is very utopistic in its essence, and that if we have this situation where we no longer have private property, we no longer need to go to war. There's no more reason to go to war because everyone owns everything, and most wars are really about resources and money, etc. We can truly dedicate ourselves to exploring, finer aspects of humanity. We're no longer in this rat's race of accumulation, and we have machines working for us. Marx famously spoke about automation even in the late 19th century, and he argued that it was possible even back then. So you could say that Rothko's worldview was very much shaped by this. He thought that communism, paradoxically, from the Western point of view, is the only way in which humans can fully actualize and fully come to fruition their individuality, their humanity. So it's not about crushing your humanity, quite the opposite. It's about actualizing it, and it's about fulfilling it and making it come to fruition. So what we want to say is that not this is necessarily truth. That's a completely different discussion, but it is something that communists believe in. And it is something that drives their particular worldview. So Rothko felt this way. When he was creating his paintings, he was creating them for the community, but a type of community that is made of individuals, not the gray mass that it's completely uniform, but a community that's made for actualized individuals who are, who are developed in their humanity and who are actually, for the first time in human history, to a full capacity human. And when he is talking about this, all of this, and when he's making his art, again, he seeks a way to humanity through emotions. And this is how he is, again, comparable to Fauvists. So when we're looking at this whole idea that he made religious paintings, that his paintings had to do with the sacred, and that they had to do with this experience that you would have in front of a painting, that it brings you down to tears, we cannot fail to mention the experience many people have in front of Orthodox icons. That when you see a particular icon that is phenomenally well made or has other qualities, this is how many people react. It really brings them to tears because it faces them with their own humanity. It faces them with who they are trying to become. It opens up all of these questions about the meaning of life, about purpose of life. You can see this being an ambition of many other stylistical formations of the 20th century, and this one in particular when it comes to aspect of humanity that has to do with emotions. The main premise behind it, why I make this short and very underdeveloped comparison between Rothko's work and Orthodox icon, the main premise is that you are not necessarily looking at the icon is looking at you. This is why it has the inverse perspective. This is why you have this completely shifted the sense of space. icon is the image to the outer world, to the higher world, and it really is a window. It's a window that you are to look at through your soul, as that window is looking at you. If you remember what Nietzsche said about looking in the abyss after a while starts looking at you. So this is a similar situation. And if we're looking at Rothko's paintings, and as well as many other paintings that were made by a lot of his colleagues and contemporaries, the whole idea is that you seek a particular type of humanity, politically, ideologically, and artistically. So you seek a very refined type of humanity that is present in a very refined type of drama, not the booming, contorted, loud, and majestic vision of Baroque, not the oversaturated Orientalist, fairly aggressive, I would argue, and at the same time fairly reductive take on things that exists in Fauvism, but a very subtle human drama, the very subtle human, I would say, notion of existence, really. It's all about subtlety here. When you're looking at Rothko's paintings, they are, again, large blocks of paint, 2 or 3 blocks, sometimes of similar paint, and it really seeks to explain this idea of disbalance, and it really speaks about the softer, less chaotic part of humanity. If you think about action painting, it's all about, again, drama, but a very violent one. It's very aggressive. It speaks about the act of creation as being this immense struggle, as being very painful, as being very difficult. There's none of that here. This is basically about harmonies and about slight disbalances between harmonies. And it's a much softer approach, less aggressive, less violent take on humanity and really on what art is. So I would say it's much more mellow. That would probably be the adequate term, mellow. It does not mean that it's more superficial. You could argue that you can be quite profound about a certain thing while you remain mellow. So it doesn't have to mean that this is a lighter take on things than what we see it with Baroque. It's just a different approach. So I guess there was, I see that our time is slowly coming to an end. And I see that I wanted to, in my notes, I wanted to dedicate a certain amount of time to aestheticism of ugliness and how and why it has to do with this particular stylistical formation, but I don't think we have enough time for that, and we can leave that for sometimes more. I really wanted to say something about it only when it came to later stages of Rothko's development, not necessarily of his work in its entirety, but yeah, it turned to that direction. Now, I also want to finish by stating that the very term Fauvism comes from the name, the appellation of the wild beast in French. And while these two stylistical formations obviously share so much, this is one aspect where they differ because, again, a color field is all about harmony and mellowness and equilibrium, if you will, of the human soul, of the human experience. And sometimes equilibrium and harmony can bring you down to tears. Sometimes that's really what you lack. Sometimes you understand that this calm, peaceful take on humanity is the missing piece of the puzzle that completes everything. So obviously this is a very interesting take on things. Obviously it's non-representational. If you're looking at these paintings, you can see that they don't really stand for anything except for humanity itself. And it's a very interesting take on humanity. So I would like to conclude with this. And I would like to announce that our sequent lecture is going to be about a far less palatable aspect of humanity. We're going to be dealing about consumerism. And yeah, but we'll talk about that more later. I thank you for your attention. I hope this made sense. And I'm looking forward to seeing you again soon. Bye.